Hello, this is my presentation on the history of Japanese-American relations from the day they met, the two countries, to the day Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Um, just to clarify, this is going to focus mainly on Japan since we covered, most of America, but I'm going to emphasize the relations between the two countries. All right, the first section, which goes from 1853, when the two countries formally established relations, to 1871. Okay, how a background on Japan. Before 1853, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate. What that was a feudal government. So the country was divided into a bunch of different sections. They were called domains, and each of these sections had a leader, and they all reported to one overall leader who was called the shogun. They also had an emperor in that time period. They had an emperor, but he was just kind of like a figurehead. He didn't actually do anything. The shogun was the one who actually had power. And in this time period, this is kind of before the date of my presentation, started in about the 1600s and went to the 1800s. Japan closed itself off from the Western world because the shogunate was afraid that the Spanish and Portuguese missionaries would debase their power in Japan through their religion and overthrow them. So they kind of close themselves off to European nations. That's not 100% true because they did have some port cities where they let certain countries have trade, but it was very limited. And overall, they didn't allow many foreigners in the country because, again, because of the Christianity factor, they didn't want to lose their authority with the native religion of Japan. They didn't want Christianity to take that kind of power from them and make the people value God more than they valued the emperor and the shogun. But they were also, to some extent, afraid of the West because the West was very mean to Asia in that time period. You could see in China, they recently in that time period, not now, this is a long time ago, they had the Opium Wars where Britain went to Japan and forced them to allow them to trade opium with them, in a war with not Japan, China was destroyed. Japan witnessed that. That was kind of like a sign that they shouldn't mess with the West. The Spain had colonized the Philippines some decades prior, I think in the 1600s, which was another sign of the West's intent to kind of dominate Asia. So Japan was very wary of letting Western influence into their country because they didn't want to lose their sovereignty over themselves. The West was definitely very aggressive in this time period. And then America in the before 1853 time period, what we covered was how slavery was kind of evolving in that time. But there was also expansionism, kind of like a pseudo imperialism where America wanted to become a world power, and part of that was getting influence in the Pacific. So recently in 1848, slightly before the presentation will start, they had taken California. America controlled California, which means they had huge coastlines on the Pacific Ocean. So American leadership at the time was looking to expand their hold on the Pacific Asian kind of region. And they also wanted to compete with the British. They didn't want the British to get too much power. That's kind of the nature of politics back then. That's a recurring theme. One country will do something so that another country can't do the same thing. It's extremely competitive. All right, Commodore Perry. So this is where our story starts. President Millard Fillmore sends Commodore Perry to Japan to force them to stop their closed country policy where they don't allow trade with the West and allow America to trade with them. Why did they want to do this? They had a couple of reasons, and most of them it was basically an economic kind of business decision. American whalers, the people who hunt whales, had been going through the Pacific Ocean ever since they took California from Mexico, and they kept going further into the Pacific Ocean. When you go across the Pacific Ocean, eventually you reach Japan, and America's a very long ways away from Japan, so they would like for their traders to be able to stop in Japan and refuel. It's safer, it's a better business decision. While they're trading, they can do business and increase the economic strength of America. Also, European countries had been for a long time at that point kind of monopolizing oil in Asia. So they would go and they would take advantage of all the oil, not just oil, really, also spices, any sort of natural resource Asia had. Europe was carving it up into spheres of influence where they could increase their economic prosperity. So Germany, Britain, France, they were all going through Asia and getting all of this power from the natural resources Asia has. And America didn't want to be left behind. They wanted a part of it. So they wanted some outlet in Asia for them to trade with. They foresaw that Japan could be that, because Japan was not undergoing major trade with any other country because of their closed country policy. And then another minor issue was that a lot of foreigners who would accidentally go to Japan were killed. A lot of them, not all of them. Sometimes they were treated okay, but a lot of the times they would be brutally murdered. So that was definitely something the U.S. was not a fan of. So in 1853, the date Japan opened its not actually that's the date when this man called Commodore Perry sails to Japan under the orders of President Millard Fillmore to force Japan to open up. So if you go to the government's website, actually, they don't really tell you the whole story because it's not that pretty. What actually happened was Perry goes into the Tokyo Bay. It was called in that time period. It was called Edo Bay, but it's really Tokyo Bay. And just to clarify, Tokyo, hopefully you can see my mouse, is in this area. Just so you have an idea of where we're talking about. This is where Tokyo is. So he goes into Tokyo with several warships, several gunboats. It's called gunboat diplomacy. And he refuses to go to the dedicated port city for foreigners. He demands to go to the head of government, Tokyo. He aims a gun at a nearby town and fires several blank shots to honor American Independence Day. It's as you know, Independence Day is July 4th. This is July 8th. So he says supposedly he's cheating to honor American Independence Day, but it's really to intimidate the Japanese. He after showing this military might with his gunboats, Japanese let him land in Tokyo, and he gives them a letter which basically says that if you don't open up your country to trade with Americans, we're gonna kill you. That's basically what I said in slightly more elegant terms, but it was definitely a very threatening and rude letter. And he says he will return in a year to get their answer to his letter. So he does give him some time, except that he doesn't give him a year. He comes back in half a year, and he demands for their answer. So, Japan and America show off each other's culture. This is more of a footnote, the culture part, when they showed each other kind of their different cultures. An interesting story is that the Japanese showed sumo wrestling to Commodore Perry on his second visit. Remember, this is when he came back after sailing somewhere else to give him half a year to think about it. Perry wrote in his diary that it was kind of barbaric and he was not impressed at all. So the Japanese did not succeed in impressing him. What Americans showed the Japanese was a mini, not mini, it's mini, that's a typo, a mini train, like a steam locomotive that they brought, and that was impressed the Japanese. But that's just a footnote. That doesn't have anything to do with the policy. And what basically Japan eventually decides is they see America is a much stronger military power, and that any war, if they even tried to fight off the Americans and keep their country closed, would just result in them being either colonized or something similar to what happened in China during the Opium War. America would destroy them and force them to do whatever they wanted anyway. So Japan really had no choice except to open up their ports under threat of a conflict with the Americans. So what happens is Perry goes to Kanagawa. You can see in the picture there, it's in red. That's where he went. It's near Tokyo. And they sign a treaty. Basically, this treaty is actually not that extreme. All of it says that American ships can stop at a couple of Japanese ports, that Japan won't, kill any shipwrecked American sailors, and the Americans will get an embassy in Japan. A consul is what they called it, basically a representative. This isn't really that extreme. So if that was where it ended, that would be where it ended, and there wouldn't be much. But of course, the Americans aren't satisfied with that, and then a short time later, they say, no, we want a much more demanding treaty. And interestingly, this is the James Buchanan's presidency, which was the last president before Abraham Lincoln. So while the whole debacle of slavery is going on in America, Japan has its own kind of issue. We have to open up our country and we don't want to. So parallel conflicts going on there. So they signed the Harris Treaty, named after the American diplomat. Basically, it opened up a lot more ports. And probably the worst thing about it was that it took away Japan's right to set their country's tariffs. They said that America will get to decide what the rate of taxes on importation would be, and that also, that's one thing, which is a terrible thing, because if you think about it, a country should have the right to manage its ports. It's a basic principle of sovereignty. So that was extremely embarrassing for the Japanese. But again, they had no way to fight it. It was either that or fight a war and then have to agree after they kill each other. And then another embarrassing aspect of the Harris Treaty was extraterritoriality, which is that in the port cities where they would be trading, Americans who committed crimes would be tried under American laws, not Japanese laws. Americans would get to decide how to punish the Americans who committed a crime in Japan, which is again extremely embarrassing because if I go to any country and I kill someone, my government should not be able to say, okay, no, he's fine, he doesn't have to get punished. No, that's up to the country you were in modern day, but not now because the Americans had the power to enforce this. And these are called the unequal treaties of Japan. China had similar treaties after the Opium Wars, but Japan had their own set after the Americans come with Commodore Perry. And after they signed these unequal treaties, all the other European countries come and sign similar treaties. And it's the same deal. Japan can't fight any of them. So what happens is Japan basically has treaties with every country, right? Every modern European country saying that, yeah, you basically get to control trade with us. We can't fight you. You're the boss. That's a very, very embarrassing thing. And it paints the Tokugawa shogunate, remember, this is the government at the time, as very weak, very ineffectual. And it shows that the Western barbarians, as the Japanese would call them, were treating them as inferior when the Japanese saw themselves as, the best. That's how it goes. Japan is losing effectively part of its sovereignty, has to legally answer to other countries, which is extremely embarrassing. And many Americans would commit crimes in Japanese ports and get away with it, which is extremely embarrassing. So the government at the time looks extremely weak to the Japanese. These next couple of slides are going to be purely about Japan because what Commodore Perry forced Japan to do actually had a lot of effect on the Japanese domestic government. Now, before I get into what the unequal treaties set into action in Japan, I wanna just clarify the revolution and the coup that follows are not 100% because of these treaties. Japan had many issues, domestic issues under the Tokugawa shogunate that existed before Perry even came. But what Commodore Perry did when he came there was he accelerated the process of revolution. So what I'm about to say has been in a while in the making, but is also recent, if that makes sense. So my first point is Japanese nationalism. So as with any country, when you create an us versus them narrative, when you're exposed to other countries that are working against you, it solidifies your own perception of yourself. So when the Americans came, Japan kind of united around the idea that Japan should not be legally withheld to these Americans, should not be embarrassed on the world stage by what the Americans are forcing them to do. So as before Perry came, Japan saw itself as a very diverse nation, a lot of different people, a lot of different societies, not homogeneous at all. But after the Americans came, Japan began to see itself as one unit. Instead of being a bunch of different units combined into one landmass, they saw themselves as one people. They began to. It's not overnight, but this is what happens. And when they start to see themselves as one people, they look for something to kind of romanticize the Japanese heritage, what makes Japan unique in contrast to all these other nations in the world. And what they kind of focus on is the emperor, the Japanese emperor, which I mentioned was a figurehead kind of ceremonial role under the Tokugawa shogunate. But they begin to kind of romanticize him, talk about how he's the epitome of Japanese identity, how he's so important, how he's a religious deity and all that. The emperor begins to become more and more of a symbol of Japan after these unequal treaties in the years between 1853 and 1868. We're talking about approximately a decade here of political fermenting. In addition to the rising Japanese nationalism, the Japanese identity that was forged after Perry came, there are also practical consequences of Japan opening up its country. The way the Western countries set up the unequal treaties was to benefit the Western countries. So the foreign imports that would come to Japan were only very, very lightly taxed. There was not much of a tax on them, which made them a lot cheaper than the Japanese locally produced goods. As a result, the local people producing these goods, a lot of them went bankrupt. And that's bad for the Japanese economy. Why? Because Japanese people are going bankrupt. That's bad. And then also there was an issue with the gold standard, because there was in Japan, right after the Western countries opened Japan up, gold was a lot cheaper than it was in the world. So foreign merchants would come buy Japanese gold and then sell it in China for a profit. So it created a whole kind of spiraling inflation system that was very bad. It was not a very good situation for Japan economically. It also encouraged the unequal treaties encouraged kind of political violence, politically motivated civilian violence. Why? Because after Perry arrives, this ties into what I was talking about, nationalism. There starts to emerge a faction of people called loyalists. These loyalists are loyal to the emperor. They see Japan as having a rich, long history that centers around the emperor's role in Japanese society. So, and these loyalists are often samurai. Now, in the West, we have like an ideal of samurai as the elite warriors, like soldiers of Japan, which has some truth in it, because samurai were the warrior class. But it's a little more than that. In that samurai was kind of more broad than that. It was also a term for the, basically the high class of Japanese society, not necessarily the rich, but those who were socially high up because of their history in battle. Not all of them were soldiers. Many of them were actually bureaucrats. But the samurai, for all purposes, you can think of them just the high class of Japanese society. These samurai were often kind of extremists. They definitely had high ideals. They thought Japan should fight against the barbarians, even if it meant death. All of that. They were very intellectually active. They read Confucian texts. They read a lot of things, and a lot of them supported very direct and very violent action against the current state of things to encourage change. So there was a lot of assassinations. There were a lot of, people dying. There were a lot of conflicts or a lot of battles in this decade between 1853 and 1868, where Japan is starting to realize that things need to change. So there's a lot of violence coming from these, high up samurai. And in addition to the political violence, there were also economic riots from the peasantry over the worsening economic conditions. That's another part that made the Tokugawa regime less powerful, because now you have a lot of internal violence. That's never a good thing for any country. Now, about politics. Now, this has to do with not just the samurai, but also just kind of like the elite bureaucracy, the people who are actually running the government. The shogunate is starting to look very weak. His power over Japan does not look strong at all. You can see there's economic issues. The emperor is increasingly becoming powerful at the expense of the shogunate. The shogunate keeps embarrassing himself. So a lot of the internal leaders of Japan see him as weak and someone that might be able to be overthrown. So a lot of Japanese leaders start to kind of distance themselves from the shogunate and increasingly support the emperor, which in turn emboldens the emperor, makes the emperor more confident in his own power, so that he starts to have conflicts with the shogunate. Because you have to remember that the actual government of Japan and the emperor are kind of two different entities. You have the shogunate, also called the bakufu, and you also have the imperial court, which is the emperor's domain. So the emperor starts to kind of refuse to endorse what the shogun wants to do, and he also forces basically the shogun to promise to expel the barbarians as soon as possible, which is impossible. He can't do that. Shogun cannot make the West leave because he doesn't have any military to make them leave. And then again, he makes the shogun agree to that. He starts to have a lot more power as these years go by. And in response, the Tokugawa does not respond particularly effectively. They have a very confused and ineffective a way of treating this issue, the growing discontent with Japan's state in the world, as a kind of pseudo colony to the West. So what the Tokugawa does, officially on paper, he promises to agree to expel the West from Japan. But on the other side, he also he tries to be conciliatory, because he knows he can't fight the West. So these are two contradicting approaches, which makes him look weak. He doesn't know what he's doing to the Japanese people. He removes reformist officials from office while promising the emperor to enact these reforms. He tries to get the public to kind of compromise with the West while also promising to expel them. What he's doing does not exactly portray him as a leader to Japanese society. And what all of these factors, everything I've been talking about for these last couple of slides, economic, nationalism, politics, civilian violence, all of them lead up to the Boshin War. Basically, in a nutshell, the shogunate gets overthrown and a new government is formed. There are a group of samurai loyalists from the Choshu prefecture adopt a lot of Western strategies in forming a militia. They form an army. An interesting note is that they allow peasants, normal people, to fight in the army, whereas before in Japanese history, only samurai are allowed to fight. So they adopt a lot of new Western strategies, which make them particularly effective against the shogunate, who refuses to adapt and embrace these Western ways. And they take Kyoto, which is the imperial capital of Japan, and from there they basically kick the shogunate out. It's not a very long war. It's not a particularly, riveting war, but what comes out of it is a new Japanese government. There's a new management in Japan. And what this is called is the Meiji Restoration. It's called a restoration because they restore the emperor to power. They make him the chief executive of Japan. Now, when I say they make him the chief executive of Japan, I just want to clarify. It's not like he's a king, because he has like a cabinet, like a bureaucracy around him that also wields a lot of power. And the emperor and the bureaucracy kind of form one institution. So when I go through the rest of this presentation and I say like Japan does this, it's not that the emperor necessarily ordered them to. It's that the imperial court, the people around the emperor, the bureaucracy, wanted to. So the emperor gets a lot more power, but he's not all powerful, even though to the Japanese people he is basically a god. Now, moving on with the Meiji Restoration. In the Meiji Restoration, after Japan overthrows its old government, there are a lot of, ironically, Western-style reforms. Now, why is this? Because in the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, in the years after 1853, a lot of samurai start to... Initially, there's just a lot of hatred towards the West, and, we need to kill them all, we need to fight them all, get them out. But as it goes on, a lot of Japanese elites start to appreciate the developments of and achievements of Western culture, all the economic, technological, societal developments that made the West as strong as it was. And the philosophy that kind of comes around in 1868 when the shogunate is overthrown is that we need to embrace the Western technology and government instead of shunning them. We need to take what made them strong, apply that to Japan, so that we can become a strong nation. So a lot of the reforms are Western style. So one of the things that Japan did after they overthrew the shogunate, which again was fueled a lot in part because of the Americans making them sign the unequal treaties. So in a way, everything that I've just talked about is a lot from the Americans. If America hadn't come to Japan and forced them to sign those unequal treaties, a lot of this may not have happened, or might have happened a lot differently. But what this leads to is Japan enacting a lot of Western-style reforms so they can become strong. One of those Western-style reforms was centralizing the government, getting rid of the old feudal system of Japan. So the central government, as normal as it seems, started to collect taxes directly from the people instead of giving it to the feudal lords. The central government took it directly. I find this funny. Before the Meiji Restoration, the government would actually take the taxes from people in rice. They would take the rice from the people, from the farmers, instead of hard cash. Instead of doing that anymore, they started to take hard cash. They realized it's not a very good system, because if the price of rice falls or increases, it can make the government unstable and end up taking taxes that are far less worth what they actually want to take. And then in line with the centralization of the government, they also kind of reorganize the bureaucracy, the cabinets. They get rid of unnecessary tidbits. They make it more streamlined. They make sure that everything is under the direct authority of the imperial court instead of being withheld to domain governors or anything. Basically, they give the central government a lot of power. You can think of the Meiji Restoration loyalists as the Federalists of America. They make the federal government a lot more powerful, which is good. This is a good thing for Japan. Militarily, there are a lot of reforms. They make a mandatory draft, which they hadn't done before. It was almost unheard of in Japan. Actually, this was a very major reform, and it was extremely unpopular in the beginning. But over time, due to efforts of military propaganda and the like, they make the military draft, um, acceptable. They institute and can create a large standing army because of this draft, like they couldn't before. And then a lot of Japanese leaders traveled actually to Europe to learn how to make a navy, how to make an army from the army and navy making facilities of Europe. I'm not exactly clear on how they got Europe to teach them, but they did. They went there and they learned how to build it up so that they could have a strong military. Another footnote is education. They made schooling, you know, actually mandatory, no truancy, and they modeled their education systems after the Americans and the French. Again, a lot of these reforms are basically to make Japan more similar to Western countries, as ironic as it is, because they overthrew the government to expel the West. But they don't end up doing that because they realize it's a much better option to become strong like the West and stuff anyway. If you can't beat them, join them. It's kind of the philosophy of Japan in this time. And then now, remember, this is all after 1868. So now we're basically done with the 1853 to 1868 time period, and we're talking about 1868 onwards, because 1868 was the date the old government was overthrown. The biggest probably area where Japan reforms itself is the economy, because Japan goes to the West, they go to all the factories and all the industrialization of America and Europe, and they realize that the economy of these countries is what allows them to be so strong. With the industrial infrastructure, with all of that manufacturing capability, they can make warships, they can make guns, they can fuel their army, they can fuel their empires. Without that economy, without that economic strength, you can't have an army, you can't be strong, you'll be weak, and other countries will take advantage of that. So Japan realizes it needs to industrialize. What they do is they increase taxes so that the Japan can increase taxes, get new taxes in cash, as I said, so that they can, fuel themselves. The country, central government. They take the revenue from these new taxes and invest them in industrial infrastructure, harbors, postal systems, factories, etc. And part of the reasons they increase these taxes is also so that they don't have to depend on foreign investment. Because if they depend on European countries to, for loans and stuff, eventually they'll just become dependent on these European countries, and the European countries will end up, kind of controlling them. Because they take a lesson from what Japan had done in other parts of Asia with these foreign loans. They start with foreign loans and they go to, installing advisors, and they go to basically controlling the country. So they don't take foreign loans. Instead, they increase taxes. And then this is probably the most interesting part. The government of Japan, even now, is very, very involved in their economy. It's not really a laissez-faire system. It's capitalism. It's not communism. It's not socialism. But the government is very involved. They fund private companies. They'll manage the different sectors of the economy. They have basically at any moment they're ankle deep, knee deep, not even ankle deep, in what's going on in the Japanese economy. So what Japan does, and this is the beginning of that, is they start, they start the first mining companies, shipyards. They're publicly owned. The government owns them. They start them to set an example to get the ball rolling for other private institutions to begin and start developing the country with railroads, with engineering, with factories. They also overpay foreign engineers, foreign educated men to come to Japan and help them set this all up. So they actually invite the West, whereas before they wanted to expel the West. It's a very interesting thing to think about how because of America coming to Japan, forcing them to open up, Japan kind of becomes like America almost. Not when I say like America, I mean in some respects. The two countries are extremely different. But yeah. So there are huge reforms in the economy, huge reforms in the military, huge reforms in the central government to make Japan into something that can be powerful. Now, the last couple of slides before I get into section 2 are about, well, the last slide actually, is how Japan views the West. And this is what I've been saying for the whole presentation, basically. The West is too strong to ignore. The modern world is not one world where you can isolate yourself. The modern world is so connected There are so many things going on, so many factors you have to consider. Like, you cannot isolate yourself and expect to remain in power for very long. You have to integrate yourself into the world. Japan, thus, embraces Western technology and societal developments to make itself into a stronger country. Japan, in order to avoid the embarrassment of the unequal treaties, in order to avoid becoming just a pawn to be moved on the world stage, embraces the dark side in a way and westernizes. This is basically the summary of this whole PowerPoint so far. Japan westernizes itself to avoid being eaten by the West. They visit Europe, they employ Europeans, they model their institutions after European models, they even make a pseudo parliament. A lot of the Japanese reforms are made to make them like the West. And yet at the same time, the West is still seen as an enemy. In 1871, they go to Europe and to America to ask them to reform these unequal treaties, and they're told just straight to their faces, no, we're not going to. You're not modern enough yet. And additionally, a lot of the aspects of European and American society are seen as no, they're seen as not good. We don't like these. They don't like the democratic, they saw it as kind of like extreme democracy of the West. They don't like the women's rights and feminism movements of the West. They don't like that. So while they do acknowledge that they have to embrace a lot of these Western reforms, they don't exactly like Western society. And then that's all I have to say on this 1853 to 1871 section. Um, one more thing is that Japan starts to see itself as a natural leader of Asia. They start to see themselves as the power that should control Asia. And now, after all of these reforms, after these decades of making themselves into a stronger nation, they're beginning to be able to do that. After they industrialize, and after they reform their economy, and after they reform their political systems, they become more powerful, and they become more powerful rapidly. With the new factories, with the new industry they have, they're able to manufacture warships, guns. They're able to arm themselves. They're able to begin to fight. So Japan, very, very rapidly, extremely rapidly, in the course of almost, I think, 20 years, begins to be able to be a power. They're not a power yet. The West still sees them as very primitive, very backwards. But the truth of the matter is, they're about ready to go into the next phase, which is the beginnings of imperialism.